All right, we should now be set and going with the recording of the final study guide. Here we are. Welcome to my humble abode. Here's the study guide for the final. Basically, we're going to begin with the first item on the list, which is Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, here's the map that it divided up the Middle East into. It was the agreement following World War I, if we remember, between the French, the British, and the Russian Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was going to be dissolved at the end of World War I because they lost. And so the British powers and the European powers decided to divide it up into different spheres of influence or protectorates, France, Britain, and Russia. Right? So there's the signatories and the authors of the agreement. The agreement is important because it is the origin of the victims of a map metaphor. That's the title of the collection of work by Adonis and by Darwish. There's more guys who drew it up and signed it. This is in the study guide, of course, right? It was officially known as the Asia Minor Agreement, 1916 secret agreement between France, Britain, and the Russian Empire, sort of. They assented to it, and they divided up the spheres of influence in southwestern Asia, i.e. the Middle East, the Near East. Right. Basically, the issue with this was it divided things along boundaries that were artificially imposed. There's no actual national history or origin for the countries that were created following the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It more or less generically and indistinctly drew up these boundaries that the people who lived there would then split based upon sectarian guidelines or based upon artificial boundaries, and it created a lot of friction amongst the peoples who were living in the area previously, right? Right. So it's the issue that Darwish takes up. It's the issue that the map is the symbol for in the Arabic poetry, right? All right. So Adonis now is number 2 on our list. So Adonis's characteristics of his verse, right? Remember, he experiments with free verse. Before this, Arabic poetry, Arabic verse was never free verse. It was always highly regulated and rhymed in meter, and he kind of was the avant-garde and the first one to start breaking the rules with Arabic verse. Now, he also included things like variable meters. So he had a meter system in one of his poems, but not in the other. He would depend upon what he wanted to do. Before that, the meter was structured specifically by Quranic intonation and by different oral traditions that were facing or were traced back to Islamic society. Right? All right. Prose poetry. Prose poetry, i.e., that poem that looks like a block of text, like a prose novel, that does not have a set line length or meter or rhyme to it, that reads like a story. Adonis does the first to do that in modern Arabic poetry, right? So he does that as well. Another thing about Adonis, he engages in themes of exile. He's originally a Syrian poet who's then, because of his radicalism or his willingness to break the rules with poetry, is exiled to Lebanon, where he goes to college and eventually founds 2 literary presses and starts the poetry movement there. So he's still not allowed back in Syria by the time he dies, and that's a problem for him. So exile is a point for him too. Transformation. He talks about the transformation not only of culture and of individuals mythologically, but also of individuals into spiritual or secular whole entities, right? The Arabic culture can be transformed through the use of poetry in new and interesting ways that prior to this, the poetic tradition in Islam and in Arabic culture did not allow for. That's his basis. His poetic voice is usually playful and prophetic, not morose and focusing on violence. He's a lot more happy and in general, witty with his words and with the things he talks about, as opposed to Darwish, who we'll see next. But final thing about Adonis, he's the founder of Arabic language poetic modernism, i.e. modern poetry in the Arabic world traces itself back to Adonis. All right, Darwish. Now Darwish is a little sadder of a guy. He's a Palestinian who was born in Palestine. He's very occupied with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. He's concerned a lot with anxiety and identity of Palestinians and anxiety and identity on a personal level. Right, he's concerned about Palestine's place in the world and the different European powers and the different UN resolutions that are trying to, he thinks, like eliminate the Palestinian perspective or existence. So he's opposed to Israel a lot of times, and his ongoing tensions with Israel are reflected in his poetry. He's focused on exile, but not so much like Adonis is about longing for the homeland, but as an activist who's actively trying to break down borders and establish a new state that he can call home. Darwish is a lot more violent in his language, a lot more political overtly, and a lot more anxious towards Israel and the European powers in the Middle East. He longs for in his poetry politically focused power, not just individuality or identity, but actual political power to change things with Israel, Palestinians, and the world. Separation or separatism politically. He favors separatism from Israel, like 2-state solution is not quite enough for Darwish even. He wants like a 1-state Palestinian solution where Israel has to break off and relinquish a lot of its territory. So that's his site as well. He writes about the concept of homeland in a way that is anti-Israeli occupation, he calls it a lot of times, anti-Israel's existence a lot of other times, right? He focuses on violence in his poems and uses these poems and this violence as a political tool. So you'll see a lot of times violence in his poetry is being used for political ends, or the poetry itself is being used for political ends. That's how you tell it's Darwish's poetry, right? Brandon Courtney's poetry. U.S. Navy guy, right? He writes beautifully and in very nice, pretty, formal, kind of like Shelley and Keats old school romantic poetry lines, right? Very regular lines. Doesn't have a lot of weird long lines, and he writes a lot of stuff that's in a good meter or has rhyme within it, right? In his book we read, Inadequate Grave, it carries the themes of the Odyssey through, and it's in conversation with the Odyssey, right? There's a subheading that says, here's lines from the Odyssey, and then his poems come up, and they give a reflection or a correlation of experience of his own based to that Odyssey theme or that Odyssey line, right? He deals with mental health and homecoming a lot, more than any other poet. He talks about mental health issues, both in the U.S. and overseas. It talks about mental breakdown and PTSD in personal and introverted kind of ways. He's disenchanted with the military service. Like, largely he's not in favor of or promoting kind of patriotism or that view. He's kind of had it with the military and the experience he had there. So it's a tone you can get in his poetry as well. Loss of friends. Remember, The Inadequate Grave is focused largely on the death of his best friend and what that did to him, psychologically, physically, and with his military experience. The sea, changing the body into something beautiful, right? This is another of his themes he focuses on, is how through death even, the sea can take the body and rework it into coral and something beautiful, into a transformative, transcendent experience that the body can never be before it dies, right? The ocean can reclaim the body for life in the afterlife, right? Reclamation of the body by nature, like I said, the whole idea of the body becoming dust, becoming the air in the earth, becoming the food for plants, becoming something that's reused, and is beautiful in that way too, right? And therefore the ocean is configured as a tomb in his poetry. The ocean is both grave and earth and mother and tomb, right? Okay. Next we have, the ocean is an insurmountable obstacle to humankind. Like, it's something we can't master. It stands at the edge of all human experience and something we cannot overcome. It will overcome us. It will kill us. It will be our tomb. And because of that, Courtney has a lot of incomprehensible and insurmountable images for the ocean. All right, Landes. Remember, these are the Afghani folk poems. They're 22 syllables in length. There are 9 syllables in the first line and 13 in the second line. They're a spoken poem that's never written down, or not usually until they were recorded by our intrepid Western reporters, right? So it's an oral tradition. They're subversive, they're bawdy, they're lewd, they're sexual, they're provocative, right? They're anti-patriarchal. They make fun of the men who are in charge in the society in Afghanistan, either by making fun of their masculinity, their sexual prowess or the lack thereof, or their ability to run a family or a war, their soldierly prowess, their political prowess. It chides them at all of this, right? It rewrites traditional folk themes by updating the language, right? So what became a shawl or a sleeve or an ankle in the old traditional Landes is a bra strap, or is cash money, or is the internet now in the new updated Landes that are currently being written and recited, right? Landes are traditionally about one of 5 themes: love, grief, loss, homeland, and war, right? Those are the things to remember about Landes. Malala. Remember, Malala is not the education activist from India who got attacked by ISIS and hurt a couple of years ago. This is the woman whom that Malala was named after, who's an Afghani, and she was famous because of the Battle of Maiwand, which is a battle that the British fought against the Afghani forces in the Second Anglo-Afghani conflict. And the legend and the myth as it goes is a young girl, against the diktats of a strict Afghan custom, took off her veil, and she roared, and she waved it around like a flag, and she said, "Young love, if you do not fall in battle of Maiwand, by God, someone is saving you as a symbol of shame." Right? So she's saying, die for your country now. This is the time we need you to fight and die. If you don't, then we're ashamed of you. No woman's going to want you again, right? Which is a Landes she recited, yeah? So her name is Malala. At 19, she was from the village of Kig, which is close to where the battle happened. The customary status of a woman, she was on the battlefield tending to wounded and supplying the troops with water and medicine. So the legend is that the battle was on her wedding day, and her husband and her father were both fighting in the battle, and she was between the troops trying to help them out. She sensed the failing spirits of the Afghans because a lot of them were getting killed. She transformed and was cried out to the soldiers, momentarily diverting their attention from a near certain defeat. When she goaded the troops to lead, the flag bearer, the Afghans was struck down by a bullet, so the flag bearer gets hit. She picks it up, and she takes her veil off and uses it as a flag in some traditions, and then she recites an Afghan Landi, which is, "With a drop of my sweetheart's blood, shed in defense of the motherland, will I put a beauty spot on my forehead, such as I would put shame to the rose in the garden." So the Afghans were re-spirited, threw themselves into battle again, kicked the British's butts, killed, close to 1,000, I think. What did it say? Close to 1,000 British people in the battle, and almost 3,000 Afghans died because they didn't have the technology or the training as the Brits did. But it was a certain crushing defeat for the British. That was about all the forces they had in Afghanistan, and that was kind of the end of the day for them. So that's both the Battle of Maiwand and Malala for the test. Blood stripes and Marine Corps uniform emblem or item given to NCOs. They wear as a red stripe down their legs, and their uniforms, both service alphas and dress blue uniforms, as well as service Charlies and Bravos too. The other thing is that the ceremony, it's pinned on, literally the strip of fabric is taken against the soldier or the Marine's leg and pinned on with nails through the garment, so there's actually a real blood stripe on the leg, and when you get that ceremony done. IED stands for improvised explosive device, know that. No, the Six-Day War was the war between Israel and Palestine when all the countries in the Middle East, especially Nasser and Egypt, kind of formulated it, attacked Israel. Israel won decisively and claimed a lot of land that was previously occupied by the Lebanese, Egyptian, and Jordanian military. And so that's established new boundaries of Israel, which Darwish especially is not a fan of. But here's the whole history of the war. Know this. The first Anglo-Afghan War, right, was fought between the British East Indian Company and the Emirates of Afghanistan from 1938 to 42. A bunch of British and Indian soldiers were lost, but more than triple that number of Afghans were lost because of the technology difference again. Second Anglo-Afghan War is from the Battle of Maiwand, where Malala myth comes from. Oh, there's a train in the background. Hang on. All right. So you can hear, there's the train. Da, 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 da. Cool. So anyways, the Second Anglo-Afghan War. The Afghanistan was invaded again by the British and the Indian forces, who were a British protectorate at the time. The Battle of Maiwand and Malala happened during this war. It ends in the Afghanistan's defeat and the establishment of a puppet regime in Afghanistan by the British government. So there's that. Battle of Maiwand again, July 27, 1880. It's where Malala comes from. It's a decisive victory and the only victory for the Afghans in that war. Parallel response is how Brandon Courtney's poetry interacts with the Odyssey in his collection Inadequate Grade, right? There's a response or a line from the Odyssey, a section, a quote, and then he responds to that with his own poetry and experience, right? Political rebellion and activism is Darwish's concept. It's the poeticizing of violence in exaggerated or politically charged fashions. There you go. A ghazal is an Arabic form of poetry. It's composed of a minimum of 5 couplets. Remember, a couplet is 2 lines of poetry. They're not rhymed. However, they are structured thematically and emotionally autonomously, meaning that each little couplet, each 2-line section is going to have nothing to do with the others. They're established to be like a string of pearls in a necklace, not a continued line of poetry or a narrative, right? And the only similarity of the linking portion is a refrain that occurs in the end of the first 2 lines and then the end of every other line from there out, right? For example, let's find here. Here we go. What will suffice for a true love not, even the rain? But if he bought grief's lottery, bought even the rain? So there's the opening couplet, right? You have the refrain, which is even the rain, ending both lines. Following that, the next couplet will have even the rain only in the last of the lines, right? So you say, our glosses wanting in this world, can you remember? Anyone, when we thought the poets taught even the rain? After we died, that was it. God left us in the dark. And as we forgot the dark, we forgot even the rain. Okay, so you see how even the rain is ending the second line in every one of the couplets following the first when it ended both lines, right? That's the refrain. That's how a ghazal is structured. So you have this repeat as many times up to 15. Usually it's less than 15, but 15 is the max. That's a ghazal. Okay? Ta-da. Here's more examples of that and more detail about the form, but that's all you need to know, really. Persian, the language that Rumi was writing in, and Rumi spoke, right? It's spoken in Iran, like Arabic, without strict grammar as far as the way it looks and the way it sounds. There's no grammatical rules really in Persian, which is also called Farsi. So Persian Farsi is the language of Rumi, language of Iran, language of Persians, not of Arabs, right? So Arabic is what Hafez spoke. Spoken in the Middle East and North Africa. Language of the Quran is classical Arabic. So it's spoken in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, parts of Israel, parts of all of Palestine, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, Yemen, if I didn't say Yemen already, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco, Um,